Thank you, Vancouver Public Library, for hosting us today. This is a full house, which really shows how many people in Vancouver are connected to Hong Kong. And thank you, Shibani and Tim, for making this the first and only Canadian stop on your book tour. So we're special.
Yes.
So just a show of hands, who has been to Hong Kong before? I think most of you, so Phu Nhing Dai Ga. So we can just do this in Cantonese, you guys are fine. Yeah. So yeah, let's just get right into it because I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions for our authors. I read this in pretty much a day. It was, as someone who has kind of lived it and breathed it, I thought that I would have trouble reading it. But it was just so well written, so vivid that I was hooked, even though it's pretty painful subject material. So yeah, congratulations on a really well-crafted piece of work. So just tell us a bit about yourselves. Like you two met, you're married. Also, congratulations.
That's the big surprise in the book. That's the last chapter reveal.
Yes, your marriage survived writing a book together.
Yeah.
And so just like,
Barely.
So kind of paint us a scene, like tell us about how you got started in Myanmar and how you ended up in Hong Kong together.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Vancouver Public Library for hosting us, and to Joanna for moderating this discussion tonight. We're very excited to meet all of you. Tim and I met in 2018 in Myanmar. It was, a much more hopeful time for the world. It felt like democracy was on the upswing, sort of everywhere. Wait, did I say we met in 2018? No, 2014. 2014. And then we moved to Chicago for a few years and then moved to Hong Kong in 2018. At the time, the Washington Post, where I work, was reopening their bureau in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, having not had one for a very long time. They'd been bought by Jeff Bezos, and there was all this injection of capital to kind of reopen foreign bureaus and restart a lot of that coverage. And at that time, they were thinking, our experience was mostly from Southeast Asia. They were thinking, okay, where should we base this new bureau, whether it should be in Singapore, whether it should be elsewhere. And the Hong Kong government actually approached the Washington Post and said, please reopen your bureau here. We will, expedite the process. We will, make the visa process seamless for you guys because we really want the Washington Post here. And so that was in part why we ended up in Hong Kong, because of this overture from the Hong Kong government, which seems very, very ironic sitting here today. But when we moved to Hong Kong, I think the idea was that we would be regional in our focus, and that Hong Kong would be a place where we could kind of like collect our thoughts and like write our stories. Obviously, from the time we arrived, I think we knew that wasn't going to be the case. It already felt like things were sort of, that there was a drumbeat of things that were happening, right? With the opening of the Hong Kong Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, that was like more physical integration coming from the mainland to Hong Kong. Quickly, the Foreign Correspondents Club hosted somebody from the Hong Kong National Party, the Independence Party, and we had the first like major expulsion of a foreign journalist in Hong Kong. I mean, it was clear that things were sort of changing and the ground was sort of shifting. And then, we got to 2019, and Tim and I was sort of there kind of every day, every weekend, covering all of this together. And then, COVID happened, right? And the world's focus really shifted away from Hong Kong to the global pandemic, and then the imposition of the national security law happened. So I think with all of that, when it came to early 2021, we really felt like things were so unfinished, right? That there was so much more to say about Hong Kong. There was so much more to contextualize about what, we had seen and experienced in the years that we were there as journalists. And then, we heard this incredible story of these 5 kids who had taken a boat from Hong Kong, ended up in Taiwan, and got an asylum in the US. So, when we heard that, and when one of them agreed to kind of speak to us, we were like, okay, we really have to like make a book out of this, because there's so much history here, there's so much we want to say, and these stories like need to be recorded.
Yeah. So Tim, remind us what happened in 2019. How did these huge protests kind of come up again? Because many of you remember 2014, the Occupy protest happened, but it kind of petered out, and it seemed like it wasn't going to happen again in Hong Kong, these massive protests. So what happened that triggered these?
Yeah. I mean, I think that that sentiment was certainly true. I think the government, has acknowledged since that they were kind of monitoring the protest movement in Hong Kong and realized that it was kind of at a low as well. I actually, one of the first stories that I wrote when I got to Hong Kong was about the bridge, opening, and I went there one of the weekends when tourists were coming from the mainland, and Hong Kong University journalism student came along with me. And we were eating lunch afterwards, and she said something to the effect of, 2014, the protest movement, and stuff. And then she kind of said offhandedly, but that nothing like that will ever happen again in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And I think that was kind of the sentiment amongst many people. Obviously, that was, turned out to be, untrue. And the extradition bill, when it was introduced, I think it's interesting, again, for us looking back, that it seemed like such a foregone conclusion that it would just easily kind of move through the system. Obviously, LegCo being dominated by pro-Beijing lawmakers, that it would just be kind of rubber stamped along. I have somewhere in my inbox an email to my editor saying like, hey, the protests about this extradition bill in April and then May, like they're getting pretty big, and there's an interesting kind of spin here on this bill, and him getting an email back saying, well, it's going to pass anyway. Don't worry about writing about it. Write about it when it becomes a law because it's such a foregone conclusion. And I, said, he said, people in Hong Kong, they protest all the time about everything anyway. So, so he said, it's quite common. And I said, okay. And then obviously, in June and July, when the protests really erupted into huge numbers, not just him, but I was kind of freelancing at the time. Many other editors were then rushing to respond to my email saying, hey, remember when you sent us that email about that? Or you might want to write about it now. So yeah, I think the extradition bill in itself, I think became as many people in the room probably know, became to symbolize much more than just that that piece of legal framework. As it went on, as the government continuously mishandled and kind of avoided all the off ramps and places for de-escalation, became much more than the legislation and became really a rallying cry for much more of Hong Kong. So
Carrie Lam, the leader of Hong Kong at the time, argued that it would streamline ways to extradite people from Hong Kong to mainland China. Again, people not trusting the court systems in China. It made sense that there was a big backlash. So how many people are actually on the streets like regularly? Like Hong Kong's population is more than 7 million, so.
Yeah, the biggest marches were, more than 2 million people, so almost 2 out of 7 million people in Hong Kong. But, beyond the people on the streets, there were people helping behind the scenes in so many ways, right? There were people like, volunteering to drive home the kids after a long day of protest. There were people volunteering, their time, their money, people giving, meal coupons to kids who got kicked out of their home because they had arguments with their parents. There was this whole infrastructure beyond just the people on the streets. That it really felt like, and obviously it was hugely divisive, but it really felt like an all of society kind of all-in sort of movement in a way that honestly I don't think we've seen anywhere else in the world before.
Yeah, so I had already left Hong Kong in late 2018, but I went back in mid 2019 to observe some of these protests, and it definitely seemed different from what seemed like almost routine protests when I was working at South China Morning Post, where people go from one start point to the end. It felt like a last stand that people were really fighting and felt like if this didn't happen, then things would just decline. When did you start noticing that things were kind of getting pretty intense, that this wasn't just the classic Hong Kong protests that ended peacefully, that people were getting hurt?
I think probably, July 1st when the LegCo break-in happened. Shibani and I, at the time, were working from like a really small sort of WeWork type office in Admiralty Center above the MTR station, if people are familiar with the area, overlooking Tamar Park and Harcourt Road. And so we had been there for a number of hours after the march ended that day. And then we would kind of go upstairs and Shibani would update her stories. I would like stare out the window and look at what was going on, reporting. And then I'd go back down, and then we'd go back downstairs, and we kind of like go back out on the roads for a couple hours. Then we'd go back up, and we were doing this over the course of the whole day. And people had surrounded, LegCo very early in the morning, and it seemed like.
What is LegCo for people who might know?
Oh yes, the Legislative Council building, down in Victoria Harbor. And they were originally trying to get in through the gates and break in through the windows, and it seemed like there was just no way that it would happen. We had been coming and going for a number of hours, and they really hadn't made much progress. And I thought they're really just exhausting themselves banging on these like clearly fortified windows. And then a couple hours later, Same thing, hours go by, and then Shibani and I were standing outside later at night. Obviously, it was dark by this point. And then we saw people in construction helmets going up the escalator inside, and we looked at each other and it was like, wow, they really made it in. And I think that was for us kind of a moment, and probably for many people observing the protests or taking part, a huge sort of shift or change, right? I don't think there was a lot of conjecture at the time and people, pundits saying, oh, this is going to really splinter the movement, like this type of vandalism, people from Hong Kong won't stand for it, it will break apart. That obviously didn't turn out to be true. But I do think for both of us, it was kind of a moment of like, wow, this is really quite serious in the scale, I think kind of dawned on us.
Yeah, and I guess just to add, right, like for all the people who got in, there was so many people behind them passing them supplies and everything else, right? I think, just to pick up on what Tim said, there was so many moments where we saw things escalate and escalate in terms of the sort of kind of more quote unquote radical action used by protesters, but we never really saw a backlash against that compared to 2014 during the umbrella movement. There were people debating whether breaking a window was like acceptable, right? And then you saw this like real kind of like not just like understanding, but sort of sympathy for, using these kind of tactics and stuff. And I think a lot of that was just a spiral of the police response and how shocked people were by it, right? And how, this like trust that Hong Kong people had in their institutions, be it the government, be it the police, were really sort of crumbling around them. And then in that space, it was totally acceptable to do all those different kind of things.
Yeah, so not just mass arrests, but what else did police do to try to shut down these protests?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of really bad crowd control, tactics. At the beginning, I think it looked to us, and we would talk to some policing experts and things. One of the kind of weird crossovers is that we had both been reporting in Chicago before we moved to Hong Kong, where there had been the McLaughlin murder, and like the police accountability had been like a big part of our job. So weirdly, a lot of the people that we had talked to in Chicago about policing tactics and stuff, we kind of called them up and said, do you mind looking at like what's going on in Hong Kong and give us some ideas and things? And that's where one of the projects that Shibani kind of spearheaded came out of. But at the beginning, it looked like they just really didn't know what they were doing. It was really like disorganized, and they were bad at crowd control. I think that clearly became clear rather that wasn't really it. Then they were just becoming extremely brutal dealing with people. They kind of went to the mass arrest tactic later. There was a lot that led up to that, in kind of the way they tried to handle it, whether it was just kind of like firing tear gas all the time, kettling people, trying to grab individual protesters and sort of like make a show out of arresting them super violently. I think they really struggled, obviously, and as they continued to fail in their tactics, it spiraled and kind of motivated people in a big way.
And there was at least one live round, like a gunshot.
Yes, yeah, and then some shootings that took place later on as well. Yeah.
And then the response from what's called the frontliners, which the title of your book also braves. In a way, it was also controversial because a minority of this group of frontliners. Maybe property damage became more widespread, but in one incident, as you wrote, when a man was trying to stop protesters from vandalizing a subway station, they doused him in flammable liquid and set him on fire. There's a lot of just like raw emotion and some violence there. And you also, how did you deal with this tension in your book where there was some bitter disagreements about tactics? I know even among relatives I have and people here living in Vancouver, families are divided. Even if they were all pro-democracy, some people felt that some of the more, they would call extreme protesters, were ruining it for everyone, that if you just stayed peaceful, Beijing wouldn't crack down, but what they're doing is going to lead to a decline in freedom. So how did you deal with this tension?
Absolutely. So, one of the things we didn't want to do approaching this book as journalists, obviously, was to ignore the violence happening on the side of the protesters. I mean, if you read the book, obviously, it's approached from an accountability angle with, Beijing, the Hong Kong government, and actually even the US government bearing kind of a lot of accountability responsibility for, stuff that happened throughout those years. But we obviously didn't want to ignore, very real kind of violence and kind of overstepping of that line that happened at times among the protest movement in Hong Kong. But I think what we really wanted to do was have the people in our book kind of speak to why people got radicalized and why and how, you can start off, apolitical or being really peaceful, but things can move you in a direction where you feel, I really want to hurt a cop, or I really want to hurt someone in the government. And I think we wanted to kind of humanize that feeling, because it was a very real feeling. It was people really did change over the course of that few months and over the years, right? Into believing, okay, we have to defend ourselves because nobody will do it for us, right? And maybe one of your questions was going to be about this anyway, but July 21st, 2019, the Yuen Long. I'm sure all of you probably know what I'm referring to, but the attacks that happened at the subway station, where white-clad gangsters basically were indiscriminately beating up protesters and stuff. I think that was one of the main kind of things that led to sort of this radicalization. We just wanted to make sure that we contextualized all of it.
Mm-hmm. And you have 4 main characters in your book. Can you just quickly go through who they are?
Sure, yeah. One of the characters, Reverend Chu Yiming, an older, pro-democracy activist. I think that's probably, flattening him a little bit. He's involved in the church, in Hong Kong and a lot of civil society. He's much older than the other characters in the book, and we used him to kind of bring people back, I think, to even before 1989, but really to 1989 and Project Yellowbird, moving, mainland dissidents or student protesters rather, to Hong Kong and then on to third-party countries after the crackdown in Tiananmen. And he was, really helpful, I think, a super fascinating life story. He's kind of been at all these really important parts of the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. And also, like I said, he's older, so his life journey was a really good arc to kind of fill in some of the history of Hong Kong, of the economy, and most importantly of the pro-democracy movement in its infancy in '89. And then one of the other people is Tommy, who is a younger man who starts out. He's an art student. He was an art student in Hong Kong. He was very apolitical. Didn't really take part in the umbrella movement much at all. Just kind of went to see it once or twice. Got very involved in 2019. He was arrested on a number of occasions, and decided rather than kind of face court in Hong Kong that he would flee to Taiwan on a speedboat, a little kind of Zodiac, with 4 other protesters. They didn't know each other at the time. They were intercepted by the Taiwanese Coast Guard near Taiwan, and then they were held there for a number of months before a deal was done between the U.S. government and the Taiwanese government to resettle them in the U.S. Tommy now lives in New York. He was at one of our book events the other day. He's doing well. And then Fin Lau was now a very well-known activist, I think, amongst many people, watching Hong Kong, based in the UK. At the time when the protests happened, he was a pretty professional young man working outside of London, living in sort of a posh, neighborhood. But then at night, he was very active in the online community, writing about, the protest movement, and came up with the Lam Chao mantra, which took on kind of a life of its own on the streets. Living this very dual life. The people he was working with didn't know that he was involved in this. People in Hong Kong didn't know who he was. He gave some interviews anonymously. Eventually, he was, outed by Chinese state media.
What's the Lam Chao movement, just quickly?
Sure. Yeah. This kind of burn with us mantra, right? That if Hong Kong is going down, that we should make sure that the people responsible are punished and kind of pull it all down with us. In short, I think is kind of the shortest way to sum it up. And now he lives in the UK. Some of you might have seen the news fairly recently. He's one of the people with a bounty on him. He's wanted in Hong Kong. And then the last character is Gwyneth Ho, who is a journalist at the time of or student and journalist at the time the protest started, eventually made her way into politics. Was one of those people who captured some very key moments of the protest. I think she was, Shibani and I were interested in her because she seems so important in Hong Kong, but internationally she never had the hugest kind of highest profile, but in the city and to the movement, she was such a key figure. And then she was arrested with dozens of other people for allegedly violating the national security law, and she's currently in jail. So the 3 of the characters live outside Hong Kong. Gwyneth obviously lives in Hong Kong in detention. She's been denied bail, though she hasn't been found guilty in the NSL case yet. It continues on, seemingly delayed constantly. So.
Yeah. You referenced the national security law, so How exactly did the 2019 protests end, would you say? And how did this law kind of come down and really change Hong Kong as we know it?
Yeah, so, in 2020, I remember January 1st, 2020, we were still at like a pretty sizable protest. I think there were like 700,000 people in the streets that day, pledging to continue on the movement into the new year. One of the things that was really notable that was happening then were like all these unions that were forming related to specific industries, right? So there was like this kind of new phase, right? People wanted to kind of like formalize, what it means to be kind of fighting for democracy or be part of the movement within their, within their offices, within their schools, within their professions, so on and so forth. And you also had, momentum building towards the Legislative Council election that was due to happen that year in 2020. Then obviously COVID hit. COVID.
At the same time, the extradition law didn't become a law. The extradition bill did not become a law.
Right.
So why did it not end in like a victory, but how did it devolve?
Yeah. So I think the the extradition, the dropping of the extradition bill was only one of the 5 demands that the protesters came to have. But really, the ultimate and the most fundamental of those was full democracy, right? The ability to elect Hong Kong's own leaders, which was promised under the Basic Law, which was promised, by Beijing and by London during the handover, right? That was, promised to generations of Hong Kong people, right? It's the root of sort of everything we're talking about today. But so, with that sort of unfulfilled, right, there was a pledge to kind of continue fighting on into the new year, and to sort of like formalize the movement and the energy of the movement, within the halls of power, right, within the Legislative Council, within sort of, industries and so on and so forth. Then when COVID hit, obviously Hong Kong and many of us, have the recollection of what happened at SARS. People took that very seriously. People stopped gathering, and it really, really changed the dynamic of the city in a huge way. What we reported in our book was already by that time, Beijing and Xi Jinping had sort of tasked a very small team to kind of work on a solution to the Hong Kong problem, which would then take shape as the national security law. So that was already happening. But I think, what COVID did was essentially give them space to kind of introduce this at a time where there could not really be the kind of mass violence, uprising, upheaval that you would have seen had it been introduced kind of early on. So with COVID sort of quietening things down, Beijing in April or May, sort of floated this idea that there would be this new law. Nobody kind of knew exactly what shape it was going to take. And then, ultimately, I think they shocked kind of everyone, including the Hong Kong government, by passing it unilaterally in Beijing, totally bypassing the entire Hong Kong legislative system and just sort of handing it down and imposing on Hong Kong with the details so unclear that they were only released literally hours before the law itself passed. I remember that night so clearly, all of us staying up and reading it and seeing it was so much worse than we had imagined, and realizing immediately what this meant, and this shock to every person, every institution that has really continued on till today.
Yeah, because the law is so vague. What does it mean to subvert national security? Basically, as a journalist, because it applies not only to Hong Kong citizens, but anyone in Hong Kong or even riding on a Hong Kong registered airplane. The Hong Kong police have put out these international arrest warrants. So as journalists at the time, how did you even try to practically process what the law meant for whether you would be arrested for your work?
Well, I think the first thing, of course, was the shock of kind of reading the text. But at that time you read it and, some people might remember that the most rosy outlook at the time. People said, "Well, Macau's had a national security law since for many years, and they've never used it. So maybe it'll just hang there, right?" I don't think that we ever believed that. I don't think they would put the energy. Beijing would put the energy and all the effort into making this thing, and then not using it, right? And building, moving national security departments into the thing, overtaking hotels in the city. There was way too much machinery being built for it not to be used. So I think the initial shock was kind of looking at it and seeing that it was kind of tailored in a lot of ways to things that happened in 2019, right? Disrupting traffic, specific things that you could see that they wanted to end. I think later on, we realized that it wasn't just the law itself, it was working in tandem with some of the old colonial laws that were left over from the British that were really bad that hadn't been used for a long time, right? We saw the sedition law start to get used again and again and again and again. So it wasn't just the NSL as a standalone, it was kind of like the entire ecosystem that started getting created at that time, right? And I think looking at the law right when it came out then, as bad as it was and as kind of, harsh as it was, we still didn't realize that it would be used, with all these compendiums to it, sort of, that continue to happen now.
And just to add, I think initially it wasn't so clear that essentially what made something an NSL violation, as opposed to using the many Hong Kong laws that already exist to deal with sort of riots and protests and so on,
right.
Is speech. Right, so like that was what the first NSL case kind of showed us, that it wasn't the act of running into cops that was the problem and the violation under the national security law. It was the addition of saying revolution of our times that made it, or Hong Kong independence or whatever, that made it an NSL violation, right? So if like you punch someone, that's assault. If you punch somebody and say Hong Kong independence, that's a national security violation. So in terms of like us understanding that as journalists, I mean, it was very frightening. I mean, immediately I can tell you that, our bureau had calls about it. So did the New York Times, so did the Financial Times, so did the Wall Street Journal. Immediately we all, got on the phone and like tried to make sense of like what this meant for us working in the city, what it meant to us, like interviewing our sources. Everything sort of changed very quickly.
So you write in the afterword of the book, and I'll just read a bit of it. So what the Chinese Communist Party did to Hong Kong wasn't just erase its capacity for protests. It also, after 25 years of trying, crushed Hong Kong's spirit, particularly by exonerating the very people who brutalized it. It appointed John Lee, security chief under Carrie Lam, as the city's next chief executive, elevating the former cop to the highest level of governance. This is a pretty grave indictment of what is happening in Hong Kong. So right now, what do you think the mood is like in Hong Kong because of all that's happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty low. I think John Lee the chief executive gave his policy address a couple weeks ago now. And you can see that security and national security is still kind of the top of the agenda. There's talk of, the Article 23, the domestic national security law that caused huge protests in 2003 and was eventually shelved, that will be coming at some point this year. There's talk of more regulations around cyber and the internet. I think part of that is due to the government's endless frustration with the Glory to Hong Kong search results and the problems that YouTube and Google are causing for them. So yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what we talk about and think about now is that it's not finished. Sometimes you think about, again, this machinery that's been built, and we still don't know exactly how it's all going to function or what it's all going to look like when it's done, because it's still being formed, and there's still more regulations that will be coming in the coming years.
So, this book really makes it clear, even though you focus on a few characters, they're not necessarily the main leaders of the protest movement. 2019, what's happened, a lot of it was just kind of the masses of the people, quite leaderless, as opposed to names people would know, like Joshua Wong. So how many people are in jail right now or in limbo in some sort of legal situation because of the national security law?
I think it's 200 plus who are specific to the national security law, but really there have been thousands and thousands of cases related to the 2019 protests, including like arson, riots, stuff related to the original laws before the imposition of the national security laws. And then there's also sedition, which has been used sort of in tandem and been investigated by the National Security Department, even though it's not a national security law sort of crime. So really, I mean, what's been happening is that there's been such a backlog within the Hong Kong court system and legal system that things are sort of moving at such a snail's pace that there's really no conclusion, right? People haven't had the chance for closure in any way. People don't even have the chance to kind of see what the sentencing range will be for some of these national security law cases. And we're here talking about it more than 2 years on from these original arrests. And I think that's what makes the situation in Hong Kong so kind of scary, right? Because you really don't know that you can't see the end, and in that environment, I think a lot of people are trying to support, the political prisoners by still writing letters and all that stuff. And, but even that work has become more difficult because of the limits of sort of, operating as a society, or operating, by crowdfunding or other means, right? I mean, the kind of squashing has happened on such a macro and micro level as well, that I think the space is just so constrained.
Yeah. So when did you two leave in Hong Kong, and do you think it'd be safe or wise for you to return?
We left about a year ago, and I think we left also in part because there were still COVID restrictions in Hong Kong, and many of the people we write about in the book were outside of Hong Kong, so to be able to sort of travel and visit them, we had to leave. But the other thing I would say is, because the environment in Hong Kong is so difficult, the people we spoke to for this book felt a lot more comfortable knowing that we would leave Hong Kong, right? So when we told them, don't worry about it, we're going to be gone, they were much more open to kind of sharing with us and stuff, because then they know that we are not like liable, and we're not the weak link, right? Because obviously if we're still in Hong Kong, we're the weak link. Like, we're the ones with like all this information or whatever, and then, have the ability to be questioned or whatever. So I would say it's more like for the protection of the people who spoke to us and put their trust in us that we chose to leave, rather than like a full personal safety thing. But, on the same level, right, I do think that the space is shrinking, and like, also for foreign media, we have to grapple with a lot of visa issues. So I feel like if we hadn't made the decision on our own, like, some of the visa stuff would have also gotten complicated.
And we did go back, Shibani, one more time than I did, but we did go back a number of times after we left to finish some of the reporting, and it's in the afterward. But we visited Gwyneth Ho, in jail, and got to see her and speak to her. So we did go back for some specific kind of events that we wanted to be there with for after we moved.
Yeah. So just last question before we open up to the audience. You talked about Finn being based in UK originally and being so influential in the protests. Canadians definitely played a similar role. I know many people I met personally who were up at all hours trying to do what they kind of support. You called them kind of like the parents of the young protesters who are sending, organizing ways that they can get resources or helping them find ways to escape if they felt they were in trouble. Generally, do you think that energy around supporting Hong Kong still exists around the world, or do you think people might be kind of moving on to Taiwan or moving on to other topics, and Hong Kong's not getting the attention that it had?
Well, on a like community level, the energy is definitely very much still there. I mean, we've met so many incredible. We've been around North America, sort of, doing these book stuff, and it's been really, really incredible to see people within the diaspora still have so much kind of like energy and passion, and sort of sharing their stories about what they're doing. I mean, there's stuff happening on the more like political macro level, right? Like lobbying happening in Washington or Ottawa or London, but then there's the stuff on the more micro level, right? Which is like people supporting each other from a community level, like putting on like exhibitions, cultural things, spreading sort of awareness about the Cantonese language. There's so many films, documentaries that have come out related to the 2019 movement as well that have been shown in like international film festivals. I think that has all helped, especially in the places where the Hong Kong diaspora is huge, right? I mean, in the UK, there's some, like a friend of mine is a teacher in London, and her school is introducing Hong Kong as part of the history curriculum because there's so many Hong Kongers who've moved there. Like stuff like that is definitely happening on the ground level because of the migration of Hong Kongers, outside in the wake of 2020. But I think on a more like political, like higher up level, it is really tough, and I think it is really tough for Hong Kong activists to kind of have the same energy from governments, Western governments, because not just like what happened in Ukraine, but now in the Middle East, I think the focus has shifted in such a big way, and Taiwan as well. But it's this sort of just like, when people talk about Taiwan as well, they don't talk about the people of Taiwan, right? They talk about this sort of like abstract military thing, but it's not about like, Taiwan itself, right? And in the same way, I think, the Hong Kong people or the cause of helping Hong Kongers, especially through immigration pathways, and especially in the US, that has been, much more fraught than I think anybody had imagined. And that's been, I guess, very disappointing.
And definitely this book is such a powerful work of narrative history. And you point out that in many ways, recent history is being kind of systematically erased, entire newspapers being shut down, archives being lost. Just lastly, it seemed quite kind of Black Mirror that you were relying on things like footage of the protests and, just work from Hong Kong journalists, but this was actually, you were losing it as you were trying to work on this book. So what was that like?
All the time. I mean, we would go, we would have this big, documents that we were working on with like tons of links and things. And then, when Citizen News closed or when, Apple Daily closed, all the links went dead. So we would have these when the fact checker at times was going through the book or we were going back to report one bit of it, you would click on it and it was just vanished, right? Thankfully, a lot of people did, kind of racing to archive a lot of stuff. That was very helpful. But even some of the archives originally that were put online were then taken down by institutions that were afraid of backlash or violating the NSL. So yeah, it certainly felt at times like not just on the interviewing people who were either, going to jail or getting more reluctant in speaking, like that was one part of it, the personal, but then the digital aspect of it as well, it was also vanishing. Twitter accounts that had documented so much had deactivated, so all those links were dead. It was certainly a challenge to find this stuff sometimes, and it was just, surreal. Like it was there on Monday, and then on Tuesday it was just gone.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this work. It's in hardcover, it's print, it exists. So thank you. So yeah, just a round of applause for our writers. So let's have questions from the audience. Let's take a look. So one here. So try to just kind of stand up and shout it. We don't have mics.
Yeah.
Can you comment on the non-Chinese, non-white Hong Kongers, families who've been there for generations or for whom Hong Kong is their home?
Yeah, I mean, in what comment, as in like how do they feel about everything?
And what's their status now?
Yeah, I mean, I think when the protests were massive, there was certainly, a huge amount, a huge swath of people, not just, from age groups. I think a lot of people focus on the young people, but there's also, age groups across the age spectrum and also socioeconomically. We met many of those people, when we were protesting. The term, Hong Konger is wide, I think. And I think it was, for us, I think one of the more heartening bits of the protest at one point was when there were some attacks. I think some people might remember that Jimmy Sham, a well-known pro-democracy activist in Hong Kong was attacked. There was a lot of vitriol and kind of racist comments about the people who attacked him being, of South Asian descent. One of the really heartening things was to see kind of the pushback against that and to see people kind of like reaching out to learn more about other parts of the Hong Kong community they didn't know about. There was, tours that went on of Chungking Mansion for people, we went by there on one protest and stopped inside and, I think a lot of people had spent their whole life like in and around that neighborhood, never been inside or never met people that worked in businesses in there. So I think that part of it was really interesting to see people kind of like discover other Hong Kongers who, through this movement had kind of been pushed together, and maybe their paths wouldn't have crossed, beforehand, or they wouldn't have known much about each other.
It's also interesting how it aided in the Beijing's kind of foreign influence line that these protests were so huge because the CIA was behind it. And I had friends. So like the expat community, well, actually they consider some local Hong Kongers, is pretty small. So I would see a picture of my friend, let's like call him like Bob, and he'll just be there with his like phone camera. And then you'd see him in Chinese state media. It's like, this is this FBI, CIA agent. He's directing the protesters where to go. And I'm like, that's my friend. He's famous now.
Who knew? Yeah.
But yeah. But have there been any non-Chinese descent for like people of foreign descent arrested as part of at least one lawyer?
Some of the original, NSL arrests, around the 53 that were arrested. Yes, one, a well-known, South Asian descent activist, and then also an American, John Clancy, lawyer. Although they were arrested, but they weren't charged.
Right. Okay. So more questions. Okay, you, and then you.
So since you wrote this book for a U.S. audience, what impact do you hope this book will have on American policy?
Yeah, definitely. I think we wrote the book, for
A
global audience. And I think we wanted to make sure that by having a lot of personal stories, people could pick it up and connect to the book and the material in it, even if they're not so concerned about China or Hong Kong, right? See, even if China or Hong Kong is not on their radar, they'll pick it up, and hopefully the stories of these people will sort of motivate them or grab them or inspire them. In terms of U.S. policy, I don't think we can advocate any sort of position as journalists, but I would say that we've tried to give voice to people who have been very, very disappointed by the immigration policies in particular, right? I think a lot of people had an expectation that the U.S. would open up a sort of kind of quote-unquote humanitarian pathway or safe passage or lifeboat scheme for Hong Kongers who wanted to seek that in the U.S., similar to what the UK has done, and I know Canada has made some efforts along those lines too, as has Australia. But the U.S., people still really want to go to the U.S., right? This idea of this American dream, there's an idea of your life will be a certain way if you live in New York or whatever, and I think that has been really, really disappointing. Even the 5 kids who arrived by boat to Taiwan, and their presence in the U.S. was specifically negotiated by the State Department. Not all of them have their status. Some of them are really still struggling to, be able to travel outside of the U.S. because they don't have that status. So I think that's something that we really wanted to raise awareness of, the immigration and how both bipartisan, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration has really failed to kind of, push this through.
It seems like at least in Canada there's a bit more concrete pathways, but it's still limited. Yeah. So I had a question. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for writing this book. I finished reading it. I think it's one of the best books about Hong Kong that I've read so far. When I was reading this book, I couldn't stop comparing your book with the one written by Rick Christoph and Sherman Nguyen. They're both on the
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And their book received lots of awards. I think your book probably will.
Thanks so much.
And the one thing about author writing books, after one success, many of them disappear. Hong Kong need international attention. Hong Kong need people like your expertise and your concerns and your commitment and your understanding of the society and also of all those people involved. After reading your book, although I've been in Hong Kong politics for more than 30 years, after returning to Canada about 6 years ago, I learned a lot from reading your book.
Is this a big compliment, or do you have a question? I'm sure they appreciate all the nice words. But. Okay.
After this book, do you have a plan to write further? Because there are lots of follow-up, that cover in this story. Especially the Chinese, the Communist parties, the methodology, and also their approach and policy towards Hong Kong. So, if there are more discovery, especially about the Chinese Communist Party's United Front work during the time, especially, the duration that covered in this book, you can expose more of the dirty, method of employed by the Chinese Communist Party. I think that will help a great deal for the world to understand
Any response to that?
also the situation facing by the Hong Kong.
We hope to do more work on this theme for sure. I think not just on Hong Kong, but a lot of our focus now is looking at China outside of China, so China in Southeast Asia, China in the region, and sort of different methods, including United Front or other economic kind of cohesion, so on and so forth. So yeah, hopefully we can continue to keep doing this work. Yes.
Yeah, nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And Kieran? Sorry to. Yes.
I just had a question about the safety of activists who are not there. I work on press freedom and we do a lot of work on protection of journalists. And we always wonder, what activists are going through. So if you could talk, since you were interviewing a lot of these activists outside of Hong Kong, what kind of challenges they face and what is the security situation for them? From the security situation, but also do they have support in the international community for the countries they're in?
Yeah, I mean, I think now one of the questions that, or one of the topics that they're concerned about that comes up a lot is digital security, right? Because a lot of the work they're doing is online or interconnected, and emailing a lot of other activists and things like that. That maybe 20, 30 years ago was not the case. That their work would be so online and digital. So I think the digital security thing is something that they talk to us about a lot. It's something that I guess our newsrooms talk to us about, but I think it's something that activists are talking about a lot about now, and taking courses on and looking into and protecting themselves. Certainly one. And then I think specific maybe to the Hong Kong community, diaspora community, especially in the UK is a place where we've spent more time than Canada, but I think there certainly still is a lot of fear and about Chinese state actors. In the UK, there's a lot of distrust amongst other Chinese diaspora groups, from the mainland. There's been some pretty ugly incidents there at protests. There was a guy who was dragged into the Chinese consulate, a couple months back from Hong Kong. So I think that's probably one of the things we found, I guess, unique and maybe a bit challenging about reporting on Hong Kong outside is that there's a real, fear. A lot of people still don't want you to use their names. They want to give you minimal details for print. And I think that's pretty unique. We've written a lot about other communities, people from Myanmar who have fled the military there and stuff. And a unique thing amongst the Hong Kong group, I think, is that there still is a lot of fear, a lot of distrust. And I don't want to use the term paranoia because I think it can be used, dismissively. But there's certainly a lot of angst.
And just to add, I think that's because people know China's transnational repression and its long arm is a real thing, right? And stuff like the bounties, when they picked basically eight people from a collection of Five Eyes Western countries and said, there's $1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty on their heads basically for the return of them to Hong Kong, that had the effect of scaring a lot of others, right? I mean, because these were people who were out, using their name with their faces, very prominent, very leaders within the kind of Hong Kong diaspora and sort of activist community. And by saying, okay, you want to be out like that, that's what's going to happen to you, and then we're going to pull in your families for questioning. In Hong Kong, I mean, that has a very, very real impact, right? And I think, people have seen sort of what's happened to the Uyghur community, the Tibetan community, just at APEC, in San Francisco. There were, people assaulted on the streets there with counter protests against Xi Jinping coming to San Francisco. So yeah, I mean, I think there is this idea that even if you leave, you're not 1,000% safe, right? You can never really be. So.
Yep. I guess.
Thanks for the unique opportunity. Congrats on the application.
Yeah, library circulation. I'm going to venture a guess that it's not going to be there. It is still available online for purchase. That people have bought it and shipped it to Hong Kong and not had any issues. And then another question that we've gotten a lot on the tours about a Chinese language translation, and we're kind of in the early stages of that. There's been interest from publishers in Taiwan, so I hope. For everybody in this room and everybody else that we'll have an update on something concrete in the near future on a Chinese edition that will be forthcoming.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this will work for your book, but I found International Readers Book Depository, this website. It seems to ship it's closed?
It might be closed. It might be closed.
Oh,
yeah.
man. Okay, never mind. Anyone else tips international less shipping? Yeah? No? Okay. Yeah. Kindle, Kobo, ebooks. All right. Question in the back.
Question there?
Oh, yes. And then you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just finished reading your book. It was great. I recommend we all buy it and read it, obviously. There's a lot of despair in the book, even though, the characters are very compelling. How do you as writers kind of manage your own emotional state when you're interviewing them, when you're writing about them? right? Because there's fear of the government, or Chinese government coming after you. There's anger, there's sadness. Let's talk about your, not necessarily your writing style, but like how do you separate yourself and also write about these things?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't easy. I remember when we first spoke to Tommy, who's one of the main characters in our book, he was like, man, like, how do you deal with this? You just like listen to me say all my sad shit all the time. That was like a literal quote. But honestly, I think feeling those emotions helped us write the book. I think I can only speak for myself, but my process is like, if I don't like feel and understand all these things, then I won't be able to like write them in a way that's compelling and bring them to the readers, right? And so I really did try to like feel all the emotions and sort of feelings, what it means to be in exile, what it means to like lose your home, like what it means to make the choice that you're going to go to jail. And I think that was it really hit home when we visited Gwyneth. And that was an incredibly emotional day for both of us. But yeah, I mean, I think feeling those emotions, and also, we too, love Hong Kong and miss it a lot. So yeah, I think that actually like helps hopefully make the book more powerful and hopefully that emotional aspect kind of gets across. But I would say there's also a lot of hope in it, right? I mean, there's also these people who've survived this, incredibly sort of traumatic time and sort of hear like, the resistance is sort of in them telling their story, right? Which also takes a lot of bravery and takes a lot of courage to do. So I draw hope in that.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add is that, for whatever we felt, I guess, emotional or upset or kind of the roller coaster, I think it's also the perspective that I try to put in is the people that we were writing about, the people that, are from Hong Kong, that have deep connections, that have been involved in politics or that have been grown up there and lived on this, it every day, how much worse it is for them, and to see what's happened and to live through what's happened or have loved ones that have been sent to jail or had to leave, a career and a life behind, what writing about it and hearing the stories, sure, it makes you sad, and we did live there, but it's nothing compared to what those people have been through.
And just to add on to that, people had the bravery who were in the Hong Kong locals who write about Hong Kong. Do you have some book recommendations from Hong Konger journalists?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Reverend Chu's autobiography is coming out soon. It will be available, I think, at the end of the month. And I think that will be a really, really powerful sort of historical record and something that will be very, very important to be read. The other thing I would say is obviously all the films and the documentaries that have come out, a lot of them have been made, by people who actually are still in Hong Kong, and they had to do that in very difficult circumstances, anonymously. I think that the power of those have been really, really multiplied, right? I mean, I've seen those films in sort of film festivals in like Singapore and Korea and everywhere, and Blue Island is one that sort of immediately comes to mind in sort of situating that historical context as well, from the 1967 riots in Hong Kong and connecting that to 2019 and 1989 and connecting that as well, and I think those were very, very powerful.
And
Oh no, and also just the photojournalists who were there in 2019 who are very much like, we have the pleasure or I guess sometimes we can be away from the action a little bit to write about it. They were really there in the front lines, like taking it with like the pepper spray, the tear gas, getting shouted at. So some of their work they've put together and put out recently. La McFay who shot a lot of the kind of very iconic photos for the New York Times. Has published a photo book of the Hong Kong protests. Deacon Liu, who supplied gave us some photography. We used some of his photos in our book. Just had an exhibit in London. Those guys as well and women as well who have done really excellent photojournalism work, catching the kind of visuals of this. A lot of their work is out there too, either at exhibits or photo books. So I think that is very adds a total different dimension to the coverage.
And I'll just give a quick plug for my friends at Hong Kong Free Press. It's an English language website that is independent, and they've managed to survive, and they have all their archives online, and it's all in English and on-the-ground reporting from local journalists there.
Yeah.
So we have time for one last question, I think. Oh yes, I saw this person. Oh wait, did you ask a question already?
No.
No, okay, great.
The book ended, you guys quoting Reverend Jews, something along the lines of, when given the truth is all. the act of the recording itself is resistance. So my question is, your colleagues in Hong Kong, journalists in Hong Kong, how do they navigate the red line of Beijing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off by saying, during the 2019 protests, the Hong Kong journalists had it, we're getting a more difficult time for the police. We're getting a more difficult time for the authorities than us, me in particular, as clearly a foreigner. So the amount of respect I have for them, is endless. They were there all the time, in the front of things. They were getting yelled at by the police. They were getting treated way worse, especially at the beginning than certainly the foreign journalists were. I think I have a ton of admiration for them now, not only just, navigating, the shrinking media space, losing their jobs, that part of it. But then, there's been a lot of reinvention. You see a lot of smaller outlets starting now covering the courts. That takes a lot. That's a steep learning curve to pivot to kind of covering the courts all the time, covering national security cases that have been dragging on and on and on. And it's a huge public service that they keep going there every day to the courts. It doesn't capture the headlines internationally. The photos aren't as riveting, but certainly a huge public service that they're there kind of recording everything that's going on as these cases drag on, as protesters keep getting, sent to jail. So huge admiration for the work that they're still doing.
Yeah, but I mean, I think in terms of like navigating the red lines, I think that's going to be extremely tricky is the onset of Article 23, right? Which is the domestic national security law that's going to be passed, I think, according to John Lee, by sort of early next year, I guess. I think that will be much more targeted at the media. Even in the way it was drafted in 2003, it was very much targeted at the media. And back then, the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong was very vocal in speaking up against it. I'm not sure that would be the case today. I do think that that will make things perhaps a little bit trickier to navigate going forward.
That's a great question to end on. Thank you. Yes. And that quote from Reverend Chu about recording as resistance. So thank you so much again for these great questions. Thank you to our speakers and authors. And please buy the book or request it from not just your local library, but multiple libraries. Like they don't check your postal code. So just like that helps libraries keep them in circulation, I realize. And Tim and Shibani will be signing books over there, so line up. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.